Hey everyone, it's Ladine from Sugar Stitches Quilt Co. Welcome to the third video of my machine quilt binding series. If you haven't seen videos 1 or 2, then I've linked them here for you to watch before you watch this video, only because I cover some of the basics in video 1. In video 2, I actually show you my process for quilt binding. In this third video, I'm going to show you some of the fun things that you can do with binding, like using thicker thread, using decorative stitches on your machine. So it's not necessary that you watch the first 2 videos in the series, but they could be helpful and answer a lot of questions for you. And do me a favor and give me a thumbs up on this video if you like what you see. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you'll get all the notifications when I post new videos. Now let's jump into some of the fun decorative techniques that we can use with quilt binding. To start off our video talking about the different ways that we can add decorative stitches and exciting touches on our binding, I thought it would be best to start with a discussion about presser feet. Now, most of us have a traditional 1/4 inch presser foot that we do our piecing with. However, this is not the best type of presser foot to use when attaching your quilt binding, mostly because you have all of the layers of your quilt, and those thicker layers need extra help. That's where things like a walking foot come in handy. However, there are times where you may not be able to use a walking foot if you want to use a specialty foot, which is what I will talk with you about in just a minute. If you will be using just a regular 1/4 inch presser foot or other specialty presser feet, my biggest suggestion to you is to take your time when using those. Your machine is working to work through all of those fabric layers, and you want to make sure that they're feeding through your machine evenly and accurately. So take it from me, someone who likes to sew fast, just slow down and take your time and let your machine do the work, and don't rush things. So there's nothing wrong with using a 1/4 inch foot, particularly if you need the guidance of a 1/4 inch mark on your presser foot. It's a great guide to use. I particularly like this presser foot on my Baby Lock Ballad. You can see that on the left side it has this little small edge, and that really comes in handy for me. As I demonstrated in video 2 of this series, I sew my binding to the back and then flip it to the front and stitch right along the edge of that binding. And this small section of the presser foot is actually the perfect guide for doing that. And so I will use this foot sometimes with my binding. As I mentioned, a 1/4 inch foot would be perfectly fine to use as well. Don't feel like because you can't buy other attachments such as a walking foot or the Baby Lock digital dual feed foot that you can't have beautiful binding. You most certainly can. You just have to make sure that you're working with the tools that you do have. Another foot that I wanted to show you is the Baby Lock specialty binding foot. And this might just look like a square presser foot. However, the magic is in the underneath side of the foot, and you can see that there is actually a little notch there on the foot on the left side of the binding. And this is made again for the times if you are sewing to the back and pulling to the front. This foot actually feeds right along the edge of that binding to give you the perfect area to sew and attach your binding, as I mentioned. So this is another new favorite of mine. When I got my Baby Lock Ballad machine recently, I added this foot on as well, and I really enjoy using it. That notch makes all the difference because it glides the foot along. Also in video 2, I showed you my method of glue basting the binding, and that coupled with this foot make things so much easier because the fabric isn't moving or bunching, anything like that, and then you can just take your time and glide the fabric along. The next foot that I wanted to show you is helpful in the method of binding where you attach to the front and then pull to the back. Then you would be stitching in the ditch on the front of your quilt. I give you an example of that in video 2 as well. And this is a specific foot for stitching in the ditch. And you can see that there is a little guide that goes down the middle of your presser foot. They make all sorts of different variations of this foot. This is the baby lock version of it. And what this does is this little metal notch actually glides along the ditch or seam of your binding so that you can just sew along, making sure that this notch is staying in the ditch as you sew. Again, making things much easier. I mentioned a walking foot, and this is my Baby Lock walking foot I actually have for my Baby Lock Jazz sewing machine, and this just attaches to your machine, and you can see that it has these little grippers on the bottom, and as you're moving the quilt through the machine, it just simply makes a small hop just to make sure that all those layers of your quilt are evenly feeding through the machine. So this is such a helper. The problem with this, obviously, is that you can't use the other specialty feet that I mentioned. However, you can see that there are plenty of notches and areas on your foot. So what I like to do is just find the area that I like to use in reference when I'm using my walking foot, and then I use that as my guide. And then lastly, I have what I'm considering my new toy because I am in love with this. I didn't have the option of using this with my Baby Lock Jazz, but since I have upgraded to the Baby Lock Ballad machine, I now get to enjoy the digital dual feed walking foot from Baby Lock. And you can see this is a much larger foot, and it has a cord that actually attaches to your machine, so it's communicating with your machine. The biggest difference, and what I love the most, is this belt that goes along and it helps feed your quilt through the machine, and it feeds so much easier and nicer. I have just a regular foot on it right now, but they do make different presser feet where there's more of a visual opening here for you to see to use with perhaps decorative stitches. This is a great presser foot that ensures your fabric and your quilt is moving through evenly, and you won't have any of those pesky puckers or any problems with your binding. And as I mentioned in video 2, where I show you my glue basting technique, couple that with a foot like this, and binding actually is no longer a task that I dread. So now that we've talked about the various feet that you can use with your binding, I want to talk about some of the various weights of thread that I like to experiment using in my binding, and then also how they can highlight your binding and give you different options than perhaps just a regular straight stitch. I typically piece with a 50 weight thread, but I will usually do my binding or quilting in something a little bit heavier. You can use a 40 weight thread that you can see is just a little bit thicker than a thread you might want to piece with. But also I have been experimenting lately with using heavier threads. This is a 28 and 12 weight thread, and you can see that those are definitely thicker threads. And you may not have thought about using these in your binding with your machine. However, they actually add such an amazing touch to your binding. You're able to see that thread better. And then if you decide to use a decorative stitch, they really make things stand out. I have an article on my blog that I've linked down below in the description for you that goes into more detail about how you can use thicker threads in your machine quilt binding. And then of course you always have the option of hand quilting your binding, and that is an amazing, beautiful touch that you can add such personality to your quilt. We won't be covering that in these videos. We're strictly talking about machine quilting. So now that we've talked about some of the tools that we can use in binding, let's go over to my machine and I'll show you some of the techniques that I use to get a different look on my quilt binding. Okay, and here we are at my machine now, and I have attached my digital dual feed foot to my machine. And what I love about this digital dual feed, as I mentioned before, is that it actually communicates with your machine. So as soon as I plug it in, the machine is going to recognize that I've attached it. And you can see here I had a regular presser foot on, When I connect it, then it changes to the digital dual feed foot. And then it gives me the options that I have to use with my foot. Now, the wonderful thing, if you have a computerized machine, you have so many options for choosing different stitches to use in your binding. Don't be afraid to experiment with things like the zigzag stitch or any of the other stitches that you may have in your machine. There are a lot of options that you probably have on your machine, and I'd encourage you to play around with some. I'd like to show you a few of those and how they can highlight your binding. So let's go ahead and choose just this zigzag stitch for right now, and I'll show you what that looks like on the binding. Okay, and I have my binding ready for finishing off. I have used the glue basting technique. My binding is sewn to the other side, and then I've pulled it around, glue basted it all around so I can start my stitching. And you can see how nice it is. I don't have to worry about moving any of my wonder clips. I do have them here on the corners just to make sure that those corners don't move before I get there. Otherwise, everything is glue basted. I want to show you first just simple straight stitch techniques on the front of your binding that you can try differently. I'm using a 50 weight thread, and I just want to show you the difference in stitch length. So stitch length is going to be the first thing we're going to review that can make a difference in your binding. And again, I like to actually identify a point on my digital dual feed foot, and it's actually this inside portion here. I will follow along the edge of the binding to get that binding in the place that I like. If you're using any other foot, I will show you the binding foot here in a little bit, but I'm just going to show you first with the digital dual feed foot. The first stitch I want to show you is at a 3mm stitch length. And then I'm going to go up to a 4, and I want to show you the difference. Now, because this is a demonstration, I'm going to be starting and stopping and using different techniques on this one example sandwich. So I've just sewn a little bit. I'm going to cut my threads, and then I want to show you what this looks like. And again, this is a 50 weight thread with just a 3mm stitch. This would be something probably where I would use a thread color that would blend more with my binding. I'm not tending to show it off as much. Now let's try with a 4mm. And I want to show you what that looks like. That's one of my other favorite things to do, probably because I don't hand stitch, but I'm trying to get a more distinguished look on my binding. Okay, I'm going to stop and cut my threads. And then now you can see that binding starts to stand out a little bit more at 4mm. You can see the comparison with the 3. And if we were using something where we had a thicker thread, this would really stand out. I'm still using a 50 weight in the bobbin, but if you're using a different weight on the top, it can really make a difference in that look of your top stitching. So on that note, let me change my thread and we'll use a thicker thread and see how that looks. Now I have a 28 weight thread, and I want to show you the difference in using this with the 4mm stitch. Take a look at this 28 weight thread at a 4mm stitch next to the thinner thread, the 50 weight at a 4mm stitch. You can see already how that really stands apart, and it can be a great addition to your binding. And now let's take a look at what a 12 weight thread looks like on our straight stitch binding. And as I mentioned, I have a blog article that covers adjustments that I made on my Baby Lock Ballad to sew with the thicker thread. Your machine might need different modifications, particularly the needle. The needle and the speed are the most important things. We always want to make sure that we're going a bit slower when we're using a thicker thread, allowing the machine to do its job. And then also you always want to make sure that you have the proper needle in your machine. I'm using a 90-14 in my Baby Lock. So let's see what a 12 weight thread at a 4mm stitch length looks like. Now look at that, how pretty that looks. That is really starting to give it some dimension. As you notice, you can see the thread a lot better. I'm using a very light gray, but it still really stands out. So you can see how that can be a definite contrast in your quilting. Next, I want to demonstrate the binding foot that I showed you that Baby Lock has, where there's an actual notch in that left side of the binding foot. So what happens is you're able to butt that up just enough against your binding so that you can sew that uniform stitch that we're looking for. And you can't really see it right now, but when I put my presser foot down, that's when you can really feel where that is to feed it through. Now it's not on a walking foot, so you do need to go slower and be careful that everything is feeding through nicely, but it's so nice to be able to have that uniform look. So let's just do a little bit of the straight stitch. I still have the thicker 12 weight thread in my machine at a 4mm, and let's take a look at that. And see how this binding foot is just gliding along underneath on my binding. It's so nice. I'm going to go ahead and cut my thread. And I went slow, so there were no issues, but you can see I have a nice uniform stitch. And there's no, what I've been known to do is be really wavy along here. So I use the tools that I have to make sure that my stitch is uniform, a uniform distance away from the edge. I'm going to change my thread back to a thinner thread, and then I want to show you the possibilities with some decorative stitching on your binding. Okay, I've changed my thread, and now let's look at some of the decorative stitching options. Again, this is with my Baby Lock Ballad machine. Your machine may be different. You may have more or less stitches, but I guarantee there's something in your computerized machine that you can find that would be great for your binding. One of my favorites is this zigzag stitch, and then you can see here the Baby Lock Ballad shows you the example of what it would look like. If we wanted to increase the stitch length, I could do that, and you can see how that changes the look. I don't necessarily want to increase the width of the stitch though, because I am sewing this on the binding and I don't want it to be too wide in that area. But you can see how changing the stitch length, this is at a 3mm. If I go to 3.5, it gets even wider. So I'll practice with that 3mm, but I also want to show you a few other stitches that are really pretty to use. We also have something like this, which is a nice wavy stitch. This might not be something that we want on the binding because it's too wide of an area depending on how big your quilt is, but you can reduce the stitch length and you can see how that wave changes. Also have something like this, which is really pretty little loops. If we increase the stitch length, you can see what that starts to look like. There's applique stitches that might be a good option for you. There's so many different things that you can experiment and try with your binding. And this is one of my favorite stitches too, just little X's that go along. And again, if we change the stitch length, you can see how those change as well. So I think I'm going to do this one first. I'll show you this. And then I do have another favorite, and that's this little star with a small little stitch in the middle, and you can see as you increase that it changes too. So actually let's do that one first. That one's really cute. So let's go back over to the machine with my quilt and we'll take a look at that one. Okay, so I still have my binding foot on, and in the case of using decorative stitches, sometimes it's nice to be able to use a different foot that may give you more visibility. You might want to use something like this where you have the ability to see and make sure that you're still lining up your binding appropriately. So I'm actually going to change to this foot. This is actually an applique type foot. As I mentioned, it does give us the ability to see a little bit better when we're working with those decorative stitches, because you want to make sure that you are lining everything up the way that you need to for that decorative stitch. This is something that you might want to try out if it's a stitch that you haven't used before. Try it out on a scrap piece of fabric first to see exactly where your needle is coming down and then how much room you need on your binding. You wouldn't want to start here on the edge, and then once that decorative stitch starts moving over to the left, then it's on the quilt itself. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I actually know where this stitch lines up, and I know that I want to line up the edge of my quilt binding with the edge of this clear plastic portion of my foot, and that puts my needle in a better position for that decorative stitch. And I do have a 40 weight thread in my machine now. And anytime we're using a decorative stitch on your binding, anything like that, you want to just make sure that you go slow, take your time, and let the machine do the work. You're just simply guiding things along. And you can see how I'm keeping that edge of my presser foot in the same space so that my binding is uniform, or the stitching on my binding is uniform. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and let this stitch finish, and then I'm going to cut my threads to show you. All right. But look how adorable that is on that binding. Isn't that cute? And it makes such a difference. I don't do hand quilting, but I love the ability to add special touches to my binding, just like we do to our quilts too. I think sometimes our binding comes as an afterthought that we just want to hurry up and finish, but it really is another opportunity to take your creative skills to another level. Well, this video is wrapped up, and it also wraps up my 3-part video series on machine quilt binding. I hope that you found these videos helpful to you, and they can really encourage you to tackle those problems that you may have with quilt binding or things that you don't understand. There's nothing like working so hard on a quilt just to be confronted with frustrations and problems in your quilt binding when it's the last step before you or a loved one can enjoy that quilt. For me, I found that mastering quilt binding really made the process of making a quilt far more enjoyable because I didn't dread that last step. I really enjoyed it and embraced it. I used it as an extension of my creativity as well, and I hope that you can do the same. So I hope you enjoyed this video and the series. If you didn't catch videos 1 and 2, then go back and take a watch at those, and let me know if you have any other questions, comments, or if you want to add anything. The quilting community would love to hear from you too. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye for now.